A promise, I'm back. Good evening once again. Welcome in today's video where we are going to be looking about what we call the tract with none other than TUMNAD. And if it's the very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell such that whenever I load the video, you become the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the tracts, okay? And of course, the tracts, they are going to be at the back of your mind. You need to know that they're going to be part of what we call the white matter. So we need to know what a tract is. But simply, a tract is going to be the bundle of what we call the axons within the central nervous system, okay? A bundle of axons within the central nervous system. That is what we call a tract. But of course, don't confuse it with what we call a bundle of axons, myelinated axons within what we call the peripheral nervous system. That becomes what we call a nerve. But for the case of a tract, is going to be that bundles of axons within the central nervous system. They appear white just simply because of the presence of what you call the fatty substance, which you call the myelin phase. So let's go ahead and see where do we find these tracts. And of course, when we talk of the tracts, we're going to be having these tracts which are going to be moving the information from the spinal cord up to the brain. And we're also going to be having those kind of the tracts which are going to be moving the information from the brain down what we call the spinal cord. In that way, we're going to be having two means of what we call the tracts. We're going to be having those ones which are going to be ascending, and we have those ones which are going to be descending. Are we together? So we are going to be having those ones which are going to be ascending and those ones which are going to be descending. For that reason, those which are going to be ascending, they're going to be carrying the sensory information from the lower areas through the spinal cord and take it into what we call the brain. For that reason, ascending tracts, they are going to be carrying sensory information. Okay. For that reason, they are going to be sensory. Okay. They are going to be sensory. They are going to be sensory tracts. Okay. And of course, when we talk of the descending tracts, they're going to be moving the information from the brain down the spinal cord and out to the effectors. For that reason, they're going to be carrying the motor information. Okay, so now the descending tracts, they are going to be carrying what we call the motor. They're going to be carrying what we call the motor information. Okay, that is something basic that we need to know, that ascending tracts are sensory, while descending tracts are motor. Okay. So now we need to see where in the spinal cord white matter, where do we find these kind of tracts which are going to be ascending and then descending. Before we go into the types of the ascending tracts and the descending tracts, we need to first understand this cross-section of the spinal cord, okay? And of course, when you see the whole of this red structure is going to be part of what we call the gray matter. Okay, it's going to be part of the gray matter. Now, the other side, the peripherals, all of its sides is going to be part of what we call the white matter. Now, this one at the back is what we call the dorsal column. Okay, is what we call the dorsal column, and then this one in the lateral side is what we call the lateral columns, and this one in front of the gray matter is what we call the anterior or the ventral column. You may even call them the funiculars. Okay, you may call this one the dorsal funiculi, lateral funiculi, and then the ventral funiculi. It is within these different kind of the white matter within the spinal cord where we're going to be having the ascending tracts and then the descending tract. But this is something very important and it's exceptional. In the dorsal column, we only have ascending tracts. That is something which is very unique within these different white columns within the spinal cord. In the dorsal column, we only have ascending tracts. We do not have the descending tract. So let's go ahead and see the different types of tracts and where exactly within with these different of the columns where they pass exactly. Okay. Now we are going to first draw a small imaginary line within this spinal cord, and we make this area to be showing all the ascending tracts, and then the whole of this have to be showing the descending tracts. But at the back of your mind is that all the ascending tracts within the lateral columns, they can also be here, and of course all the descending tracts within this side can also be this side. But we have just made an imaginary line to show only the ascending tracts within this side and then only the descending tracts within this side. Okay. So now within the dorsal white column, what are those the ascending tracts within the dorsal white column? Now In the middle here, we have what we call the dorsomedian sulcus. Just very close to it, we have this kind of the tract. And this tract is very important. And this tract is what we call fasciculus gracilis. Okay? This kind of the tract is what we call fasciculus. Is what we call fasciculus. Okay? Is what we call fasciculus. Is what we call fasciculus gracilis. Okay? Fasciculus gracilis. And this kind of the tract is going to be carrying sensations like fine touch, vibrations, and even what we call proprioception, mainly from what we call below T6, okay, or what we call the lower extremity, the lower limbs, and even the lower trunk below T6. That's going to be what we call the fasciculus gracilis, picking all those kind of the sensory information. And then this one, number 2, just on the lateral side of what we call the fasciculus gracilis, we have this kind of the tract, and this tract is what we call fasciculus cuneatus, okay? Fasciculus cuneatus, okay? It is also very important, carrying sensation like fine touch, vibrations, and proprioceptions from the upper limbs and then upper trunk, primarily above T6, okay? So now this is going to be picking sensations below, this is going to be picking sensation below T6, and this one is going to be T6 and above. Okay, that is something which is super very important. But all of them are going to be carrying sensations of what we call fine touch, vibrations, and then proprioceptions. Okay, and of course the combination of fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus together, they form what we call the dorsal-column-median lemniscus pathway. We shall look at that one in great detail later. Okay. Now, coming on the lateral white column, we want to look at what are those kind of the ascending tracts which are going to be part of what we call the lateral columns. You have this number 3. Now, this number 3 is what we call the dorsospinocerebellar tract. Okay, is what we call the dorsospinocerebellar. Is what we call the dorsospinocerebellar tract. And this kind of tract is super very important in the way that is going to be helping up in picking sensations of what we call proprioception. Okay, proprioception. Okay, proprioception, and mainly from what we call C8, up to L2, but you may find some other sources telling you from what we call T1 up to L2. Okay, so now that's going to be what we call the dorsospinocerebellar tract. Okay, then you also have this kind of the tract which is going to be number 4, which is super very important. And this kind of the tract is what we call this number 4 is what we call the lateral spinothalamic tract. Okay, is what we call the lateral spinothalamic tract. And this kind of the tract is super very important in a way that it is going to be helping in what we call picking sensations of pain and then also temperature. Okay, it's going to be picking sensations of what we call pain, and even also what we call temperature. Okay, that's going to be what we call the lateral spinothalamic tract. And then we also have what we call number 5. You see this kind of number 5? This number 5 is what we call the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Okay, this one here is what we call the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Okay, ventral spinocerebellar tract. And this kind of tract is super very important in a way that it is helping in what we call picking sensations of what we call proprioception. Okay, proprioception, mainly from what we call L2 up to what we call COX. Okay, so now that is what we call the ventral spinocerebellar tract. And then also have this kind of tract which is going to be number 6. This is what we call just spinal olivary tract. Okay, this kind of the tract is what we call spinal olivary. Okay, spinal olivary tract. And this kind of tract is super very important also for picking up different kind of sensation, like what we call proprioception. Okay, proprioception. So now those are going to be examples with the ascending tracts within the lateral white column. Okay. Now when we come to the ventral white column, you see this kind of big man, this kind of big tract is super very important among the ventral white column ascending tract, and this kind of the tract is what we call the anterior spinothalamic tract. Okay, this kind of the tract is what we call the anterior, okay, or what we call the ventral spinothalamic. Okay, spinothalamic tract. And this kind of the tract is super very important in picking up sensations of what we call crude touch, sensations like crude touch, okay, and even also some kind of what we call the sensation of what we call the pressure. Okay, so now that's going to be one of the main super very important what we call the ascending tract within the ventral white column. And of course there are going to be some other kind of the minor kind of ascending tracts. We also have some kind of the minor ascending tracts, like what we call the tunio, what we call tunio cerebellar tract. We also have what we call spinotectal tract. We also have what we call spinoreticule. Okay, we also have what we call spinoreticular what we call tracts. And of course these kind of tracts are also super very important in the normal physiology of what we call the picking up the sensations from what we call the spinal cord into the different parts of what we call the brain. Okay, so now that's going to be now the ascending tracts in the different kind of the white columns, from the dorsal white column, lateral white columns, and also ventral white column. Okay, so now I'm coming on what we call the dorsal white columns, what we call the descending tracts within the dorsal white column. Something which is super very important is that we do not have descending tracts within the dorsal white column. I want to repeat on this. We do not have descending tracts within the dorsal white column. That is super very important. Okay, no descending tracts. Okay, we do not have no descending. There's no descending tracts. Okay, no descending tracts within the dorsal white column. This dorsal white column, we only have ascending tracts, which is fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cinereus. That is it. Okay. Then coming to what we call the lateral white column. Now, the lateral white column, you're going to be having these two kind of very important kind of what we call the descending tract. You see this kind of tract, which is going to be number one. This kind of the tract is what we call the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, is what we call the lateral corticospinal. What we call the lateral cortical. Okay, lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, lateral corticospinal tract. And this tract is super very important, and it's going to be aiding in what we call voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. Okay, it's going to be aiding in what we call voluntary control of skeletal voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. Okay, that is going to be one of the main important lateral white column descending tract. And then this is going to be what we call lateral corticospinal tract. Then we also have this kind of tract which is just slightly below what we call the lateral corticospinal tract. This kind number two. This number two is what we call the rubrospinal tract. Okay, is what we call the rubrospinal tract. Okay, is what we call the rubrospinal tract. And of course, this kind of tract is also very important in the way that it's going to be aiding in what we call stimulating the limb flexor muscles. Okay, stimulating in what we call the limb flexor muscles. Okay, super very important. Okay, so now these are going to be two most descending tracts within the lateral white column. Then when we come to the anterior white column or the ventral white column, we have a bunch. We have a lot of the descending tracts. Okay, let's go ahead and see each one individually and where exactly is going to be located. So now, this kind of the number 3, this kind of the tract which is going to be in the anterior white column, this one number 3 is what we call the lateral reticulospinal tract. Okay, so what we call the lateral reticulospinal, what we call the lateral reticulospinal. Okay, lateral reticulospinal tract. And this tract is super very important. You see this one number 3, a very important lateral reticulospinal tract. It is super important in stimulating lower motor neurons, which will activate what we call the flexor muscles. Okay, it's going to be responsible for stimulating what we call stimulating the flexor muscles. Okay, what you call the flexor muscle. Super very important. Okay, so now coming to number 4, we have this kind of the tract which is just going to be just slightly anterior on what we call the lateral reticulospinal tract. Now, how do we call this kind of this tract which is going to be number 4? This one, number 4, is what we call vestibulospinal tract. Okay, this one number 4 is what we call vestibular. Okay, what we call vestibulospinal tract. Okay, and this tract is super very important in what we call stimulating what we call extensor muscles. Okay, stimulates what we call extensor muscles. Super very important. Okay, that's going to be our number 4. Now when we come to number 5, which is just going to be just medial on what we call the lateral reticulospinal tract. So now this number 5 is just going to be what we call the medial reticulospinal tract. Okay, it's just simply going to be called the medial reticulospinal tract. And this tract is super very important in what we call stimulating extensor muscles. Okay, very important in what we call stimulating extensor muscles. Okay, this is also such another beautiful thing that you need to know. Okay, so now that is going to be our number 5. Then we have this number 6, just very so much anterior on what we call the ventral white column. Now this number 6 is what we call the tectospinal tract. Okay, number 6 is what we call the tectospinal tract. And this tract is super very important in the way that it helps in the movement of what we call the head and the neck, such that you're able to see if something just touches on your lower limbs, you just turn the head automatically to see the kind of the substance that has touched, the kind of the stimulus. For example, you have just stepped on the nail and you have withdrawn off your leg. But of course, you have to look there and see exactly what kind of, how big is what we call the nail that has pierced you. So now, that kind of the visual reflex towards the visual stimulus of something that has touched you in the lower limbs is going to be under what we call the tectospinal tract. So now this tract is going to be helping in head and neck movement. Okay, head and neck movement. So now that's going to be tectospinal tract. Then we also have this big kind of descending tract. This one number 7, also very close to the anterior on what we call the ventromedian fissure. This one number 7 is super very important, and this one is what we call the anterior corticospinal tract. Okay, is what we call the anterior corticospinal. Okay, anterior corticospinal tract, super very important. And this kind of the tract is responsible for what we call voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. Okay, what we call voluntary control of what we call skeletal skeletal muscles. Okay, super very important, activating the lower motor neurons, which will activate the voluntary control of the skeletal muscles. Okay, so now again we also have very minor kind of the descending tract. Super very minor is what we call the olivospinal tract. Okay, also have what we call olivospinal tract. Okay, this is such another beautiful thing, and one of the most important, what you call the descending tract, which you call the olivospinal tract, that picks such kind of the motor information from what you call the inferior or livery nucleus down into what you call the spinal cord. Super very important, working hand in hand with some other kind of different tracts. Okay. So now this has just been a brief anatomy of these different tracts on where they are going to be located within the different parts of what we call the white matter of the spinal cord. So now in the next proceeding videos, you're going to be looking at these kind of tracts individually, one by one, in great detail. Now, for example, on the dorsal white column of the ascending tracts, we have the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus tunatus, which together form what we call the dorsal column median lemniscus pathway. We shall look at that pathway in great detail and see how they're going to be moving to the medulla oblongata to form what we call the nucleus tunatus, nucleus gracilis, and how the informations relate to the thalamus before it reaches what we call the cortex. We shall have to look at that kind of what we call the dorsal column median lemniscus pathway. And of course, we'll look about all these other kind of the different tracts one by one in great detail. This has just been a brief introduction of what we call the tracts. And of course, I thank you very much for watching. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please make sure you like the video. Comment down in the comment section. You can share this video to someone else whom you think is in need of this kind of the knowledge. And don't forget to subscribe at the end of it all. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD all along from the beginning up to now. And of course, as always, until we meet next time.